How long it was before the mists of terror that clouded his brain finally cleared and lifted, how long he stumbled blindly through the night, Rowan could never guess. When he finally came back to realization of his surroundings, he found himself standing knee-deep in water and mud, standing in a thick forest whose dark trees formed over him a great canopy of twisted foliage, and whose floor was a swampy expanse of shallow pools and yielding sands. Far behind him there glowed feebly in the sky a glare of ruddy light, half glimpsed through the rifts of the foliage overhead, and as his eyes took in that crimson glare, sudden memory came to his dazed brain. "God," he whispered, and again the single syllable, "God." For minutes he stood there, paying no attention to his own surroundings, his mind on that tremendous and unthinkable attack which had crashed upon Brinton from the outside night, of the terrible dinosaurs and their strange riders who had descended upon the town. Whence had they come, those gigantic reptilian monsters, whose like Earth had not seen for hundreds of millions of years? And what were those lizard shapes who had ridden and directed them, whose pale rays had swept fiery death across the town? Abruptly, Rowan's mind snapped back to consideration of his own predicament, and swiftly he looked about him. The thick forest around him, the mud and stagnant water in which he stood, the odor of rotting vegetation in his nostrils. In a moment he recognized them. "The swamp," he whispered. "I came eastward from the town, and this." A moment he passed, glancing around, and back toward the glare of red light in the sky behind, then turned and began to move forward. Through stagnant, scummy pools he splashed, feeling himself sinking once into treacherous sands, but jerking out of them in swift panic, clambering over fallen trees and across ridges and mounds of solid ground, through thick tangles of shrubs and briars. Once he lay for moments on one of the mounds, panting for breath, and staring up through the twisted branches above to where the shining, unchanging constellations marched serenely across the heavens. Then he rose and pressed on, conscious only of the desire to put more and more distance between himself and the inferno of terror which Brinton had become. Abruptly he stepped out of the close forest into a wide, clear space, a broad pathway cut through that forest by some great force, in which the trees and bushes had been ground down and crushed into splintered masses. Rowan stepped into this broad lane of destruction, wonderingly, and saw that it ran east and west, apparently across the swamp. Then into his mind leapt remembrances of those great pathways of smashed trees which the searchers for Morton had found near the swamp's edge. Could it be? Before he could complete the thought, there came a sudden, dull reverberation from the swamp to eastward, a quivering of the ground beneath him, a rumbling thunder rapidly nearing him. In sudden panic, he shrank back into the forest at the broad path's edge, and the next moment there appeared in the east along that path a mighty shape, thundering down the path toward him and dimly visible in the starlight. It was a brontosaur, he saw, bearing one of the dark lizard shapes which rode at the base of its great neck, thundering down the path toward the west in giant, earth-shaking strides. Another followed it, and another, until 4 had passed, and then the thunder of their great tread died away in the west as they galloped on toward Brinton. Rowan stared after them, and then, as a sudden thought flared in his brain, he crept again from the sheltering trees and moved steadily eastward into the swamp, following the great path by which the brontosaurs had come. The path was beaten hard and flat, he found, and seemed to lead due eastward into the heart of the swamp. And as he followed it, as he crept onward, light came to his eyes from far ahead, a white brilliance which filtered faintly through the ranks of close-packed trees. Steadily Rowan crept on toward it, and then, as its radiance began to strengthen, he left the broad path and slipped again into the shelter of the forest, creeping forward ever more cautiously between the close-ranked trees and over the rotting, stagnant slime toward the source of the pallid light ahead. A dull roar of sound came to his ears as he went on, a whistling, shrieking clamor as of some great wind, which raged ceaselessly, louder and louder as he neared it. Through the trees ahead, he glimpsed a broad open space lit by the white radiance, and dropped to his knees, crawling silently on. At last, He had crept to the very edge of the open space and lay crouched in the slime behind a great tree, peering tensely forward. Before him lay a great flat mound of solid ground, elevated a few feet above the ooze of the swamp, roughly square in shape and fully 1,000 feet across. It was quite bare and treeless, all vegetation upon it having apparently been sheared away, and was lit by a single globe of radiant white light suspended by a slender shaft of metal high above the great mound's surface. At the center of the broad, flat surface there yawned a tremendous pit, which occupied half the mound's expanse, a vast circular shaft some hundreds of feet across, whose smooth perpendicular sides gleamed dully as though coated with metal. From where he crouched at the great mound's edge, he could glimpse only the round mouth of the great shaft and a few feet of its downward sinking sides, but he perceived that it was from this mighty pit that there roared upward the thunderous torrent of unceasing winds. Then his attention shifted from the great pit to the creatures grouped near its rim. At the far edge of the great shaft there rose from the ground a strange three-pillared structure of gleaming metal, bearing on an upheld plate a number of shining studs and a single large dial or wheel of metal. And beside this structure stood a knot of unearthly creatures, green-scaled, dark-eyed lizard shapes, like those he had glimpsed in the attack on Brinton. These were standing across the pit from him, at the very rim of the great shaft, and one or two of them were apparently staring down into the darkness of the shaft itself. And now over the raging shriek of winds from the pit came another sound to the crouching Rowan's ears, a faint but deep bellowing which grew swiftly louder. He saw the lizard man at the pit's edge stir a look downward, and then suddenly there rose up out of the great shaft's depths a great round platform of metal, a mighty disc-like platform fully 400 feet across, which all but filled the mouth of the great pit as it rose, separated from that pit's edge by a tiny circular gap of a yard or less. Up from the dark depths of the shaft floated this great platform, slower and slower, and he saw that upon it were standing two of the gigantic, bellowing brontosaurs, and some half-dozen more of the lizard men. Smoothly, the vast disc and its great burden drifted upward until it hung level with the edges of the pit, its vast weight and the weight it bore suspended incredibly above the abyss. A moment it hung there, and in that moment the lizard men on it stepped swiftly out onto the mound, prodding the two brontosaurs on before them. The empty platform hovered a moment longer at the pit's edge, and then began to sink slowly downward, gathering speed swiftly and dropping smoothly out of sight into the dark depths of the giant shaft. Rowan gasped. That mighty platform moving up the great shaft and down it, with upon it the great brontosaurs. From what unguessed depths below had it come? He saw that the lizard men now were swinging up into curious saddle-like seats affixed upon the backs of the great beasts, and then heard them utter rasping cries at which the two dinosaurs moved obediently forward off the mound and onto the broad beaten path, which led from its edge westward through the swamp toward Brinton. In a moment the two great beasts and their riders had thundered down that path and disappeared, while on the mound were left only three of the lizard creatures who conversed in low, rasping tones. Minutes passed while Rowan crouched there, watching them, and then one pointed downward into the shaft again, and in a moment there floated up once more the great disc platform, but empty this time. It swept smoothly up once more to the edge of the shaft's mouth, hung motionless momentarily again at that edge, and then sank from sight once more. Rowan saw then that its motion was apparently automatic, and then before he could speculate further on it, all his attention focused on the three lizard men on the mound, who were walking together toward the great path which led west from that mound. One seemed to point westward, where the red glare of light from burning Brinton still quivered in the sky, and then the three had disappeared down the path, evidently for a better view, since Rowan could still hear over the shriek of winds from the pit, the rasping of their harsh, insect-like voices in the distance. Minutes he crouched, while the white-lit mound before him lay unoccupied, and then rose suddenly from his place of concealment and crept silently across the mound to the rim of the great pit. Tensely he craned forward, staring downward. In his ears was the deafening roar of the winds from beneath, winds which tore at him with cyclonic fury as they rushed up from the dark depths of the shaft. Staring down into that shaft, Rowan could see nothing, since its interior was of intense and unrelieved blackness without spark of light. As seconds passed, though, and his eyes became more accustomed to the blackness beneath, he seemed to sense, rather than see, a quiver of light far below, a wavering flickering of light that lasted for but a moment, and then vanished. And then he glimpsed something far below that was rising swiftly toward him, something that gleamed a little in the white light from above him. The platform. Abruptly, there was a sound of sharp movement behind Rowan, and he whirled around, then stood motionless. At the mound's west edge there stood a single one of the scaled, unhuman lizard creatures, his eyes full upon Rowan. From down the great path came the rasping squeak of the voices of the other two, but the one was silent, staring straight toward him. Then, with a movement inconceivably swift, he had leapt forward. Rowan cried out as the creature leapt, then felt himself grasped by powerful taloned claws, thrown to the ground, whirling about at the pit's edge in threshing combat. He heard a harsh cry from the creature that grasped him, heard the cries of the other two as they raced now to his aid. The two struggling figures were at the very rim of the great shaft, now rolling and twisting, and in one uppermost movement Rowan glimpsed the mighty disc platform sweeping up out of the depths of that shaft, hovering motionless at its mouth beside him. He staggered to his feet, still in the other's grasp, striking frantically out with clenched fists. Now the other two had raced up on the mound he saw and were leaping toward the combat. Then Rowan gave a frantic wrench and twist, felt himself and the creature holding him tottering at the rim of the abyss, and then they had fallen, still striking and twisting, had fallen upon the great disc as it hovered momentarily at the pit's edge beside them, and locked still in deadly combat upon that disc, were sinking ever more swiftly downward into the darkness of the giant shaft, into the raging of the deafening winds. Down, down, down. For how many minutes he struggled thus with his lizard thing opponent on the great disc, Rowan could not guess. Twisting, squirming, striking, the two rolled about, and then as the powerful muscles of the creature began to wear down his own resistance, Rowan put forth all his strength into one last effort. Grasping the scaled body of the creature with his left arm, he encircled its conical head with his right, and twisted that head back with all his force. There was a moment of intense effort, a frantic threshing of the creature in his grasp, and then a muffled snap, as of breaking bones, and the thing lay limp and still. Rowan scrambled up to his knees, panting. Around him now roared the deafening torrents of ascending and descending winds, and a few feet away from him, the smooth metal wall of the great shaft was flashing upward with immense speed as the disc shot downward. From high above, a pale white light fell down upon him, a little circle of white radiance that was swiftly contracting, dwindling as the disc flashed down. In a moment it had dwindled to a spark of light, and then had vanished entirely. And then about Rowan was only darkness. Darkness and the thundering bellow of the raging winds. He crept to the edge of the great disc now, peered down over the low protecting rail that rimmed it, straining his eyes down through the darkness. The flicker of light he had glimpsed from above was clear now to his eyes, a tiny patch of quivering red light that was growing rapidly stronger, larger as the disc flashed down toward it. Crouching at the great descending platform's edge, Rowan gazed down toward it, hair blown back by the great winds that raged past him, clinging to his hold against their tremendous force. The patch of illumination was swiftly broadening until it lay across all the shaft far below, a crimson quivering glare. And now it seemed to Rowan that the downward shooting disc platform was slowing a little its tremendous speed. The gleaming walls around him were not flashing upward so swiftly, he thought. And then, even as that thought came to him, the great disc shot down out of the darkness of the shaft and into a glare of lurid crimson light, into a titanic cavernous space, which seemed to his eyes in that moment limitless. He was conscious first of a mighty curving roof of rock close above him, from which the disc was dropping smoothly downward, and in which there yawned a black circle which was the opening of the shaft down which he had come. A full mile below lay the floor of the mighty cavern, stretching away for miles on every side, a colossal underworld lit by the crimson wavering glare. Then Rowan's stunned eyes made out far away the titanic precipitous walls of grey rock, which formed the great cavern's sides, miles in the distance, stretching from floor to rocky roof. and as his eyes swept along them, they came to rest upon the blinding, dazzling source of the crimson light that illuminated all this cavern world. In the gray wall to his right, miles away, was a great slit-like opening near the roof, an opening through which there poured down a mighty torrent of blazing liquid fire, a colossal Niagara of molten flame whose crimson blazing radiance shot out a quivering glare which lit luridly the whole mighty cavern. For thousands of feet, the great torrent of raging fires tumbled downward, caught at the base of the cliff in a canal of gray stone which conveyed it, a river of living flame, into a central basin of stone of the same diameter as the great shaft above, and which lay just beneath the opening of that shaft in the roof, and beneath the descending disc, a lake of leaping flame. Around it were grouped a circle of strange, blunt-nosed machines of some sort, and down toward it the disc platform was smoothly sinking. And beyond and around it, on the stupendous cavern's floor, there stretched mass upon mass of huge buildings, gray and mighty and ancient in appearance, buildings which resembled masses of gigantic gray cubes piled upon each other in neatly geometrical designs. Broad streets cut through their square-cut masses, and in those streets moved great throngs of large and smaller shapes, mighty dinosaurs and masses of the lizard men. Far away, to the distant encircling walls, stretched the massed buildings, and over them hovered here and there great pterodactyls bearing lizard riders, flitting across the cavern from place to place on their immense flapping wings. Rowan stared, stupefied, stunned, crouching at the edge of his descending disc, and then became suddenly aware of fierce and increasing heat beating up toward him. He looked down, saw that the disc was dropping straight toward the lake of fire below, sprang to its edge in sudden fear as it dropped on. Down, down, ever more slowly the great disc was sinking now, down until at last it hovered motionless a scant 50 feet above the surface of the molten lake, hanging level with the edges of the circular stone basin which held that lake, and level with the floor of the mighty cavern. A moment only it hovered there, and in that moment Rowan saw that awaiting it at the great basin's edge stood a half-score of the lizard men. Even in the moment he saw them, they glimpsed him, crouching at the disc's edge, and instantly two of them leapt upon the disc with the white globes that held the heat beam outstretched toward him. He cowered back, but instead of loosing the ray upon him, one grasped him by the shoulder and jerked him from the platform onto the basin's edge, just as the great disc began to move upward from that edge. Standing there for the moment, Rowan saw the great disc floating smoothly up once more into the lurid light toward the black round opening of the shaft in the roof of rock above, rising swiftly into that shaft and disappearing from view inside it, as it flashed upward once more on its endless automatic motion. As one of his captors tugged suddenly at his arm, though, he turned, and the creature pointed toward the gigantic gray buildings ahead, at the same time jerking him forward. Slowly Rowan started toward them, while on each side of him walked one of the lizard men, their deadly white globes ready for action. A moment and they had left the broad, clear plaza of stone where lay the fiery lake, and were entering one of the wide streets which cut across the masses of the city's buildings. As he marched down that street between his two guards, Rowan all but forgot his own predicament. So intensely interesting was the panorama before his eyes, a shifting pageant of creatures of the world's youth, enthralling to the eyes of the paleontologist. For through the streets were pouring masses of the lizard men, bearing tools or weapons, hurrying along on taloned feet or riding huge brontosaurs who trampled majestically along the street's center, while the walking crowds clung to its sides. Here and there, too, moved other dinosaurs, almost as huge, bearing burdens or ridden by lizard men, the reptilian beast servants of a lizard race. Tyrannosaurs were there, moving along in their swift hopping gait, the fiercest and most terrible of all the dinosaurs, yet servants like the rest of the green-scaled lizard folk. Allosaurs, like smaller replicas of the great Tyrannosaurs, mighty armored stegosaurs and great horned triceratops, and over all the whirring wings of the great pterodactyls. As they marched on down the street, attracting but little attention from the hurrying lizard creatures, Rowan saw that in the great gray buildings on each side, the doors opening into the street were of immense size, 40 to 50 feet in height. and saw here and there a giant dinosaur entering or emerging from one of those great open doorways in obedience to the command of its lizard master. Then abruptly his two guards turned with him into one of them, and he found himself in a long, colossal corridor, its gray roof 50 feet above him, and its width almost as great. Here and there along this great corridor were open doorways, and into one of these he was jerked by his guards, finding himself in the presence of 3 other of the lizard creatures, who sat behind a metal block, much like a legless table. To these his guards spoke in their harsh voices. There was a moment of silence, and then a rasping command from one of the 3, at which he was instantly reconducted from the room and down the corridor's length to a smaller, bolted door. A moment his captors fumbled with its bolt, then opened the door by sliding it down into an aperture in the floor, motioning Rowan inside and keeping the white globes full upon him. Hopelessly he stepped in, and the door slid up and shut behind him, while in a moment the bolts clanged shut outside. Rowan turned slowly around, then stood rigid. Across the room from him a single figure was staring at him, and as his eyes took in that figure, a cry broke from him. Morton!
Thank you for joining the Mutant Museum on this exciting dinosaur-filled adventure. We would like to thank all of our generous supporters, particularly Michael Fattori and Break System BSE. And thank you again for being you.